We're almost finished with validating the form. Each individual field has its rules applied to it. The next thing we'll want to do is validate the entire form if the user attempts to submit it. If the user attempts to submit an incomplete form, we will need to force validation on inputs before processing the request. The way vValidate handles validation is by waiting for the inputs to be interacted with. It will not validate the moment the user lands on the page. We will need to force validation if the user doesn't trigger the validation on their own. vValidate makes it extremely easy for forcing validation. Open the authentication component in your editor. We're going to be focusing on the form component we wrapped around the inputs. On the form component, we'll add an event listener for the submit event. The submit event is slightly different from the submit event for a form. vValidate creates its own version of the submit event. It'll do two things. First, it'll force the field component placed inside it to perform validation. This enforcement includes inputs that haven't been touched. If any of the inputs are invalid, the event will not run the expression. Second, it'll prevent the page from refreshing upon submission. We don't need to add the prevent modifier. It's done for us behind the scenes. Let's add the function we want to run if the forms are valid. We'll pass in a function called register. We never have to worry about manually checking if the forms are valid. The register function will not be called if any of the inputs are invalid. Any untouched fields will have their errors rendered. This will inform the user of what inputs they need to fix. The next thing we'll do is define the register function. Scrolling down, we'll define the register function in the methods object. If the register function gets called, we know for sure that the values in the form are good to go. The submit event will provide our function with the values from the field components. Throughout this section, we never used the vModel directive to bind values to our inputs. It's not necessary to use the vModel directive in our form. vValidate comes with its own system for keeping track of the data in the form. This doesn't mean the vModel directive isn't helpful. However, we don't need the vModel directive since the library will keep track of the values for us. Inside the register function's parameters, we'll add a parameter called values. Next, we'll log this parameter. This log will let us know if the validation was a success. Let's give this a test. Refresh the page on the browser. We want a clean slate. If you're using a browser that autofills the input fields, then don't worry about it. Just empty them out. Submit the form without inputting anything. This submission will trigger an error in every field. In the console, we won't see anything because the register function was not called. The form component will not run the register function until the fields are valid. I'm going to fill out the form with valid values. If I were to submit the form again, we'd see our values logged in the console. This is great. We have a way to prevent the form from being submitted if there are any broken rules. We can proceed with submitting the data. There are some additional optimizations we can make before submitting the data. We'll look at what else we can do to make the form more user-friendly in the upcoming lectures.